This lectureship, inaugurated in 1988, represents the two foci of Professor Roland Bainton's life and work: church history and the church's witness to peace and justice. Former Bainton lecturers include Andrew Walls, Eric Middlefort, Barbara Newman, Frank Turner, and Margaret Miles. Tonight's lecturer is, I'm happy to introduce, John O'Malley of the Society of Jesus, who has degrees from another institution of venerable memory in some place up there in Massachusetts, and is a distinguished historian of the church and Christianity, with books on the religious culture in the 16th century, on the first Jesuits, on the Jesuits, cultures, sciences, and the arts, 1540 to 1773, on Trent and all that, and on four cultures of the West. Very much looking forward to hearing him this evening talk about Vatican II and what happened.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can you hear me all right? Yep. The title is not Trent or Vatican II, What Happened, but Did Anything Happen? On June 17th of this year, in the Pietro da Cortona room of the Capitoline Museums in Rome, Cardinal Camillo Ruini, the Pope's vicar for the Diocese of Rome and the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference, made a public presentation of a new book written by Archbishop Agostino Marchetto and published by the Vatican Press. The title, Il Concilio Ecumenico Vaticano II, Contrapunto per la sua storia, the Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, a counterpoint for its history. Such presentations for new publications are not unusual in Italy, but this one was special because of the official and indeed eminent status of the presenter, because of the elegant, public, and civic venue of the presentation, and because of its attack on other scholars, and because of the coverage the presentation therefore received even in the secular press. Ruini welcomed the new book because, according to him, it acts as a counterpoint, indeed as the polar opposite of the interpretation of Vatican II that until now has monopolized the historiography of the Council. He sees Marchetto as moving us along the road to a correct understanding of the Council. But Ruini, in line with Marchetto, did not let the matter rest there. He singled out the school of Bologna, whose capo is Professor Giuseppe Alberigo, as the principal and most influential creator of the incorrect understanding. More specifically, he attacked the magnum opus of the Bologna-based Institute for Religious Sciences, the recently completed, multi-authored, 5-volume history of the Council, edited by Alberigo and published almost simultaneously in 6 languages: Italian, French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. The 5th volume of the English edition, under the able editorship of Joseph Komanchek of the Catholic University of America, is about to appear, Orbis Press. Ruini, like Marchetto, compared the Alberigo volumes to the History of the Council of Trent, written by Paolo Sarpi, which was published in London in 1619 and almost immediately placed on the index of forbidden books. Sarpi's thesis baldly put, Trent was a papal conspiracy to prevent the reform of the Church. A more damning comparison could hardly be imagined. Marchetto's book is for the most part a collection of previously published articles on the Council, many of which are protracted book reviews, especially publications from Bologna, but also from other academic centers like Louvain-Leuven that share Alberigo's approach. What's wrong with that approach? Many things, principal among which are an anti-curial bias, comparisons of Pope Paul VI unfavorably with John the 23rd, emphasis on the so-called novelty of the Council and its differences from previous councils, an underlying reformist ideology, and finally, diminishing the importance of the official final documents of the Council in favor of the Council as event. These criticisms are all interrelated, but the sticking point is the last, for by describing the Council as event, Alberigo has borrowed a term, an idea from secular social scientists that means a rupture, a change from received norms and ways, a before and an after. The documents of the Council do nothing, according to Ruini and Marchetto, but insist on their continuity with the Catholic tradition. Alberigo, however, presents the Council as a new beginning in the history of the Church, which Ruini dismisses as theologically inadmissible. Ruini goes on to say, quotation, "The interpretation of the Council as a rupture and a new beginning is coming to an end. This interpretation is very feeble today and has no real foothold in the body of the Church. It is time for historiography to produce a new reconstruction of Vatican II that will finally be the true story." End of quotation. What is needed, according to Ruini and Marchetto, is a new hermeneutic that will reveal the true nature of the Council. The Ruini-Marchetto incident is not an isolated phenomenon in Rome. For at least the past decade, publications following the same general line have been forthcoming, especially from the Vatican Press and the Lateran University. They frequently quote a passage from an address Pope John Paul II gave on the occasion of a conference held in the Vatican in 2000 on the implementation of Vatican II. The Pope's words were, "The Church has always known the rules for correct interpretation of the contents of dogma. These rules are woven into the fabric of faith and not outside it. To read the Council supposing that it marks a break with the past, while in fact it placed itself in the line of the faith of all times, is decidedly unacceptable." Thus, with Ruini, Marchetto, and others, an interpretation of the Council has emerged that is based on one fundamental assumption. The Council was in all important regards continuous with the Catholic past. In fact, that assumption seems to be already well along the road to achieving official and prescriptive status. In 1985, for instance, the Synod of Bishops, meeting in the Vatican on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the closing of the Council, laid down 6 norms for its interpretation. When I examine the norms from the perspective of a professional historian, I have to say that they strike me as resoundingly sound. Number 5 is particularly pertinent for this evening's discussion. Quotation, "The Council must be interpreted in continuity with the great tradition of the Church, including other councils." Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, in the very year of the Synod, in which he played a major role, gave a long interview published in English under the title of The Ratzinger Report. In it he said, quotation, "This schematization of before and after in the history of the Church, wholly unjustified by the documents of Vatican II, which do nothing but affirm the continuity of Catholicism, must be decidedly opposed. There is no pre- or post-conciliar Church. There are no leaps in this history, no fractures, there is no break in continuity. In no wise did the Council intend to introduce a temporal dichotomy in the Church." A rumor is currently circulating that this December, the 40th anniversary of the closing of the Council, Pope Benedict XVI will issue his first encyclical, which will deal with the Council and its interpretation. The rumor may or may not be true, but it has a certain plausibility. At the moment, in any case, the Bologna school, and especially Alberigo, are being singled out as the great propagators of a history of the Council that badly distorts it and that must be opposed. I have studied the 4 of the 5 Alberigo volumes, and I've been working my way through the proofs of the 5th. In reading Marchetto, for instance, I sometimes wonder if he and I are dealing with the same Alberigo. For my part, I have the highest esteem for the Alberigo history, and in print have compared it not to Sarpi, but to the authoritative History of Trent, published in the last century by Hubert Yedin. This, of course, is not to say that the work is perfect. It has, for instance, all the merits and demerits of a collective history in which subjects have been parceled out to different authors. Underneath the impressive scholarship, I detect a tendency to diagnose the ills of the Church and to prescribe remedies. thus giving grounds to the critics who say it's not objective. At rare moments, I have felt I was reading an updated, more sophisticated, and more solidly based version of Xavier Rin's Letters from Rome that appeared in the New Yorker while the council was in session, and that practically everybody in my generation accepted as telling it the way it was. Good guys against bad guys, with the good guys winning. It is written, that is to say, with a certain perspective. Nonetheless, I was generally impressed that the authors were doing their best to be fair to the so-called conservatives or minority in the council, and especially fair to Pope Paul VI. Most important, however, I do not see Alberigo and others who have used event as an instrument to interpret the council give it the radical meaning that their critics attribute to them. In my opinion, the quotation from Pope John Paul II cannot be applied to the Bologna school, nor for that matter to any other responsible scholarship I have seen on the council. Nowhere in the Alberigo volumes is there the slightest suggestion that the new beginning meant in any way a rupture in the faith of the church or a dismissal of any dogma. New beginning, in any case, seems like a weak description compared with New Pentecost, which is how on December the 8th, 1962, Pope John the 23rd described what he hoped for from the council. Whatever the merits and demerits of the two sides, this controversy puts before us in a new, clear, and dramatic way a problem that has dogged Vatican II all along, its interpretation. That is certainly not a problem peculiar to the council, but for various reasons it is particularly acute for it. For one thing, Ruini, Marchetto, and Ratzinger are absolutely correct when they insist that the documents of the council do nothing but insist on the continuity of the council with the tradition of the church. Yet, in the years immediately following the council, we often heard that the council was the end of the Counter-Reformation, or even the end of the Constantinian era, or indeed a new Pentecost. We heard and read a great deal about the spirit of the council, which seemed to imply a reality that to some extent transcended the letter of its documents and carried with it an implication of, well, a new beginning in lots of areas. The inadequacy of the term spirit of the council gradually emerged as it became clear that your spirit of the council was not my spirit of the council. But many of us still cannot shake the feeling that the expression got hold of something that was both real and important. What is missing in the norms provided by the Synod of 1985 is one that would read somewhat as follows. While always keeping in mind the fundamental continuity in the great tradition of the Church, interpreters must also take due account of how the Council is discontinuous with previous practice, teachings, and traditions, and indeed discontinuous with previous councils. Without such a norm, the emphasis is exclusively on continuity. To insist thus on continuity is to blind oneself to change. And if there is no change, nothing happened. In other words, such continuity takes the church out of history and puts it out of touch with reality as we know it. In Catholicism, this emphasis is not new. It found its first resounding expression in the decrees of the Council of Trent, which insisted it was teaching and prescribing nothing that was not in continuity with the apostolic tradition. Later in the 16th century, it took off with Cesare Borroneo's Ecclesiastical Annals, written to counter the Protestant, the Lutheran, Magdeburg centuries, and, as the present controversy makes clear, it has never quite lost its hold. A distinguished German Protestant historian, Gottfried Maran, just a few decades ago, went so far as to criticize Hubert Yedin's treatment of the era of Trent for employing what Maran called this typical Catholic ploy. Yet historians of Trent and of the so-called Counter-Reformation have done little else but tell us how Catholicism changed in the 16th century, to a great extent as a result of the Council. Something happened. Why else would we speak of a Tridentine era? Well, did anything happen at Vatican II? Or better, did anything happen of a profound significance for Catholicism? Or better still, did the Council, as an historical happening, and even in the internal logic of its documents, try to actualize anything of significance for Catholicism? That is what is at stake here. Where do I stand? You will not be surprised to learn that I give an affirmative answer, especially to the last formulation of the question. And this evening, I will try in a relatively brief time at my disposal to tell you why. I will do so by indicating some of the extraordinary ways the Council was discontinuous with the 20 councils that preceded it that the Roman Catholic Church recognizes as ecumenical. But I must first begin with a big qualification. As a practicing historian, I have come to realize that in any social entity, the continuities run deeper and tend to be stronger than the discontinuities. The Annales school has taught us well the overriding importance of la longue durée. After the American Revolution, the citizens of the new nation continued to eat the same kind of food, read the same kind of books, think pretty much the same kind of thoughts, founded their nation on principles largely derived from their English experience, and even continued to speak the same language, English of all things. Much the same can be said analogously of the French after the bloody trauma of the French Revolution. Not only in fact, but in theory, this principle of continuity has to obtain in the Church and obtain in an even more profound way. The mission is to preach the word that was received from the mouth of Christ and the apostles. If that continuity is not maintained, forget it. I cannot imagine any theologian, any historian, any believer disagreeing with that principle. All that having been said, change happens, even in the Church. I certainly do not have to labor that point. In what ways and to what degree was the Council discontinuous with its predecessors, and what is the import of that discontinuity? These are our questions. At the outset, we need to remind ourselves that the principle, almost the only feature common to all the councils, from Nicaea in the 4th century to Vatican II, is that they have been assemblies principally of bishops that have made authoritative decisions binding on the whole Church. Other than that, they differ considerably among themselves. They fall into 2 clearly distinct groups. The first 8 were all held in the East, had Greek as their official language, were convoked by the emperor or empress. No pope attended any of them. The remaining 13 were all held in Italy, France, or Switzerland, conducted in Latin, and were in one way or another convoked by the pope. Except for the Council of Florence, no really significant participation in them by members of the Greek-speaking Church. Although bishops have for the most part been the determining influence, others have at times played equally or more important roles, as with King Philip IV of France at Vienne, or even Emperor Charles V at Trent, to say nothing of Constantine at Nicaea. Although some 400 bishops attended Lateran Council 4 and 1215, they were greatly outnumbered by the 800 abbots who attended. I could go on, but I hope I've made the point that there's no reason to be surprised if Vatican II has distinctive features. What I will try to show, however, is how profoundly significant those features are when taken in the aggregate. So significant, in fact, as to require, as Ruini has postulated, a new hermeneutic. But it is a hermeneutic that takes serious account of the discontinuity, thus putting the Council's continuity in perspective. The most obvious of these special characteristics is, of course, its massive proportions and its remarkable international breadth. I describe it as the biggest meeting in the history of the world. Not in the sense that it attracted the hundreds of thousands that events like the International Olympics do. It was the biggest only if we take into account all the factors that are integral to it, which begin with its length, that must include the 2.5 years of intense preparation, as well as the 4 years it was in session. This may not seem long compared with Trent, which stretched over 17 years. But for Trent, the numbers are badly deceptive because of the long intervals between these periods in which the council was actually in session. Trent, like most councils, met without previous preparation, yet Vatican II was prepared for on such a massive scale that those 2.5 years that elapsed between the announcement and the opening are part of it. The consultation with the bishops and others before the council filled 11 folio volumes, well over 7,000 pages. When this material was reworked by the preparatory commissions, it amounted to another 7 volumes and another 5,000 pages. These figures are dwarfed by the 35 volumes of the Acta of the Council itself, which brings the grand total to 53 volumes. The Acta of Trent, the largest for any other council, consists of 17 volumes. Vatican II issued 16 final documents. In terms of sheer pagination, these 16 are almost twice the length of the decrees of Trent, and Trent and Vatican II together equal in volume the decrees of all the other 19 councils put together. Doesn't that strike you as a spectacularly long-winded way of saying, no news, boss? Of saying business as usual? The sheer quantity of the official documentation reflects the immense dimensions of almost every other aspect of the council. On July 15, 1962, the Vatican Secretariat of State sent out 2,856 invitations to persons with the right to participate fully in the deliberations of the council. All but a few hundred, impeded by ill health or the refusal of their governments to let them attend, showed up for the council. In contrast, about 750 bishops were present for Vatican I. The Council of Trent, the least well-attended of all the councils, opened with just 29 bishops or prelates and 5 superiors general of religious orders. Even later, at its best attended sessions, the number of voting members at Trent barely exceeded 200. The bishops who actually attended Vatican II came from 116 different countries, whereas 40% of the bishops at Vatican I were Italians. Many brought with them a secretary or a theologian or both. This added up to about another 7,500 persons in Rome as direct or indirect participants. To this must be added the others who came to Rome because of official or semi-official business related to the council, which of course included about 100 observers from other churches as well as representatives from the media. By the day the council opened on October the 11th, 1962, the Vatican had distributed about 1,000 press cards to journalists. Probably close to 10,000 people were present in Rome at any given time during the council because they had some kind of business relating to it. The meetings were held in the central nave of St. Peter's Basilica. Despite the huge proportions of that space, 2,500 square meters, it was barely sufficient to hold all those with credentials to enter. The nave was outfitted for 2,900 spaces, which included 20 for theological experts, the famous periti, and 130 for observers from other churches. In order to assure that everyone present with the right to speak could do so handily and audibly, 37 microphones were installed in the basilica according to a plan that placed them so that no speaker would have to walk more than 20 yards to find one. Douglas Horton, one of the Protestant observers, noted in his diary for October the 23rd, 1962, "For the council, the great pile of St. Peter's is skillfully wired, so that with microphones in strategic places, even a whispered note can be heard in the remotest part." Every effort was made, therefore, to guarantee full participation. I could go on, but perhaps I've said enough to indicate that it would be a terrible shame and surprising if this unprecedented expenditure of time, effort, and money, which I've not even mentioned, eventuated in nothing, if it eventuated in business as usual. Yet there are still 2 more features about the participants in Vatican II that deserve mention. The first is not only the presence, but the highly influential role of some Roman Catholic theologians who, even as the council opened, were under a ban of silence imposed on them by the Vatican's Holy Office, and whose views had in one way or another been condemned. As the council got underway, these theologians not only had the ban on them implicitly lifted, but went on to be among the principal architects of the council's decrees. I'm speaking, of course, of theologians like Yves Congar, Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner, and the American John Courtney Murray. This feature of the council, too, was not only unprecedented, but surely suggests that something was happening at the council that was, or wanted to be, a change in the status quo. The second is the presence of the observers, that is, the presence as honored guests of persons who did not share many of the basic principles out of which the Catholic Church operated and were invited to make their differences known, which we know happened outside the formal sessions of the Council. Unprecedented. The presence of the observers stimulated a more searching scrutiny of the deliberations and decisions of the Council, but it was also important for nudging the Council to consider issues of concern to others besides Roman Catholics, or maybe better, besides Roman Catholic prelates. The interest in the Council of the communications media was aggressive. This too helped the nudging process. Until the Council of Trent, the deliberations of a council were almost the private concern of those who participated in them. How many people knew or cared what happened, for instance, at Lateran III? It was the invention of printing that ushered in a new situation. Trent, and especially Vatican I, had to contend with a more general and rapid dissemination of information and propaganda, much of it unfavorable, but that dissemination of information and the interest in the deliberations were still confined to a small percentage of the population, even in the West. By the time of Vatican II, however, radio and television could transmit news around the world at the very moment any newsworthy event happened. Once the Council got underway, what particularly captivated the attention of the media and the public they served was the ill-kept secret of the sometimes acrid debates and confrontations in the Council and the emerging possibility of change in posture and practice that just a short while before had seemed set in stone. The Catholic Church had presented itself internally and to the world at large as the church that did not change. It took great care to show a unified front on all issues and to deal swiftly with any phenomena within the church that might seem to suggest otherwise. Yet the debates and disagreements in the Council, despite efforts to hide or disguise them, were manifest and entered the public forum, where they were discussed and debated. They shocked some, gave delight to others, and rendered patent to all that Catholicism was not the monolith they thought they knew. The new ease of communication meant that after the Council was over, the decisions could be implemented with a speed and directness no previous council could come close to mustering, even if it had wanted to. In fact, with only a very few exceptions, the decisions of previous councils had no immediate relevance for the life of the faithful, or at least did not entail a wrenching change in received patterns. As it turned out, some decisions of Vatican II made a dramatic impact on the life of ordinary believers. When such believers entered their churches for Mass a year or so after the council, for instance, they experienced something so different from what they had experienced all their lives up to that Sunday that they would have had to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to notice it. The decisions of previous councils were directed almost exclusively to the clergy. Vatican II departed from that pattern by addressing Catholics of every status, and in the final document on the Church in the modern world, by addressing all humanity, all persons of goodwill, Christians and non-Christians, believers and non-believers. Vatican II thus took greater account of the world around it than any previous council, and assumed as one of its principal tasks dialogue or conversation with that world in order to work for a better world, not simply a better church. This is a breathtaking change in scope from that of every previous council. Whence the impulse that allowed that such a change was legitimate and good? The mentality with which many of the most influential bishops and theologians approached their task was more historical than in any previous council. This mentality, the result of the great impetus to historical studies that began in the 19th century and never abated, had in certain Catholic circles deeply affected the study of every aspect of church life and doctrine. The leading voices at the council were thus much more aware of changes that had taken place in the long history of the church and willing to draw consequences from them. This keener sense of history permitted greater freedom in judging that some practices, traditions, or doctrinal formulations might simply be anachronistic or currently inappropriate or even harmful, and therefore should be modified or eliminated. This persuasion found expression in two words that capture the justification or motivation that lay behind the Council's action. The Italian aggiornamento and the French ressourcement. Although they express almost diametrically opposed impulses, the first looking forward, the second backward, they are both geared to change. Aggiornamento means updating or more boldly modernizing. It was first applied to the Council by Pope John the 23rd himself and was soon taken up by the so-called progressive wing. Changes needed to be made in the Church to make it more viable in the new era the Council assumed was dawning. On one level, this was nothing new. The Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, legitimated changes if they were done out of urgens necessitas vel evidens utilitas, urgent necessity or evident usefulness. But two things were special about the Aggiornamento of Vatican II. First, the changes were done in the name of Aggiornamento were sometimes obvious reversals of what had previously been considered normative. Second, no previous council ever took the equivalent of Aggiornamento as a leitmotif, with this implication that the Church should change in certain regards to meet the times, rather than the times change to meet the Church. Let me repeat. I'm sorry. The bishops at the council had no intention of rupturing the fundamental continuity of the Catholic tradition, nor, in my opinion, did they. Nonetheless, they, in strikingly broad fashion, applied the Aggiornamento canon to what they were doing. In the opening oration at the Fifth Lateran Council, 1512, Egidio da Viterbo expressed the mindset that prevailed in councils up to Vatican II. We are to be changed by religion, not religion by us. All the bishops at Vatican II would subscribe to that principle, but they would interpret it in an unprecedentedly broad way. Ressourcement means return to the sources. It means return to the sources with a view to making changes to conform to a more authentic and more appropriate past. It has, a truly venerable history that has found explicit and important articulation in the history of the Western Church, beginning with the Gregorian reform of the 11th century, where a series of reforming popes launched a vigorous campaign of change in the name of restoring a more ancient canonical tradition. As the dust began to settle in the 11th century after the bitter and bloody battles that campaign sparked, the principle undergirded much of the important legislation of the Lateran Councils I and II regarding especially the appointment of bishops and clerical celibacy. It was in its Latin form the motto of the great humanist movement of the Renaissance, ad fontes, to the sources, a call for return to the good literature of antiquity. This included not only Demosthenes and Cicero, but the Bible and the fathers of the church as well. It was what drove Petrarch and Erasmus. Recourse to the sources is also what drove the Protestant reformers as they sought to restore the authentic gospel obscured and perverted by the papal church. On the eve of Vatican II, it drove much of the theological ferment in France and elsewhere that gave grave concern to Rome and elicited silencings and condemnations. Ad fontes and ressourcement. These catchwords are about discontinuity. They say that we must leap over something in the present to something better or more authentic in the past. That idea undergirds a great deal of what happened at Vatican II, as for instance the reform of the liturgy and the drive to restore the Bible to the center of Catholic piety and preaching. But most especially and most profoundly, in the literary form in which the decrees of the Council were framed. What did Vatican II change and how was it discontinuous? That question is usually answered by describing the before and the after of the key decrees. The decree on ecumenism was discontinuous not only with the polemics of the Counter-Reformation, but more pointedly with the encyclical Mortalium Animos of Pius XI in 1930, condemning the ecumenical movement. It was discontinuous with the mindset that forbade a nun in a Catholic hospital to summon a Protestant minister for a dying person. The decree on the Word of God was discontinuous with the tradition that since the 16th century had made the Bible practically a forbidden book for Catholics. The decree on the Church was strikingly discontinuous with the description of the Church as essentially a monarchy, a description that on the eve of Vatican II was insisted upon in every Catholic textbook, yet the word never once occurs in the documents of the Council. The decree on religious liberty was discontinuous not only with the long Constantinian era, but particularly with the frequent condemnations of separation of church and state by the popes of the 19th and 20th centuries. It was similarly discontinuous with their condemnations of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. If these popes repeatedly denounced all that liberty, equality, and fraternity implied, Vatican II went a long way toward embracing it. Again, I could go on. But you are familiar with these and similar changes, bitterly opposed in the Council by a minority precisely because they were changes. In my opinion, they are crucially important. They tell us something about the spirit of Vatican II. But this afternoon, I want to dwell on another way Vatican II is a council of discontinuity. It is a way intimately related to ressourcement, and it is a way, moreover, that receives little attention from historians and theologians. Yet I consider it the most profoundly significant aspect of the Council, a key to getting at that elusive spirit of the Council, and a key to an appropriate hermeneutic. It entails shifting our focus, may I say our obsession, with content and directing it to form. From what the Council said to how it said it. It entails taking into account the most obvious feature of the 16 final documents of the Council and drawing conclusions from it. What is that feature? Their length. Why are they so long? Because, as was insisted upon in the Council, they are pastoral. That's all well and good, but does not get us very far. The fact is that this so-called pastoral form is an expression of a literary genre new for councils. For this audience, I trust I do not have to insist that that fact has to be crucially important in understanding what's going on in the council. Form and content, verba et res, cannot be separated. There's no understanding a poem without taking into account that it is a poem. In our case, the form or genre results in a council different from every one that preceded it. The council adopted a new form of discourse, and in so doing, redefined what a council is, and proposed a striking model of how the church was to behave. Through the centuries, councils have made use of a range of literary genres. Beginning with Nicaea, however, practically all these genres evince characteristics derived from the legislative, judicial traditions of discourse developed in the Roman Empire. These genres, in large measure, were or closely resembled laws or judicial sentences. It is not far off the mark to postulate that the implicit model for the early synods and councils of the Church was the Roman Senate. Although that body had lost much of its authority by the time Constantine assumed a leadership role in the Church, it continued to legislate both in Rome and in its counterpart in Constantinople, where Constantine presided over it. When Constantine convoked the Council of Nicaea, he held it there in his palace. He acted as a kind of honorary president of the assembly and intervened from time to time, it seems, in the deliberations. A pattern was set. While ensuring correct belief in the Church and appropriate behavior, especially of the clergy, were of course the fundamental concerns of the Council, these aims were not and could not be separated from the securing of proper order in society at large. Law and order. The ordinances of Nicaea were enforced by the civil authorities. coercive enforcement by emperors, kings, and other lay magnates continued to be a constitutive element of councils down to Vatican I, 1870, when it was no longer politically feasible. The fundamental assumption governing councils from the very inception, therefore, was that they were legislative bodies that issued ordinances regarding doctrinal formulation and public behavior, fides et mores. To these ordinances were often attached penalties for those who failed to obey them. The very first canon of Nicaea imposed suspension on any cleric who castrated himself. The first canon of the next council, First Constantinople, anathematized all heresies. A long list of them followed. Among the literary forms councils used through the centuries were confessions of faith, historical narratives, bulls and letters, judicial sentences against ecclesiastical criminals, constitutions, various kinds of decrees. The principal form employed by Nicaea and by many subsequent councils, however, was the canon, usually a relatively short ordinance that entailed punishment for failure to comply. It is a form that clearly manifests the assumption that a council is a legislative judicial body. The Council of Trent issued no less than 130 canons for its doctrinal decrees alone, and equivalent did almost the same for its disciplinary decrees, which made up about half of the Tridentine corpus. All canons employ the same formula. If anyone should, let him be anathema. We need to note that even dogmatic canons do not strike directly at what a person might believe or think or feel, but at what they say or deny, thus at some observable behavior. As such, they are not concerned with interiority. Like any good law, canons and their equivalents were formulated to be as unambiguous as possible. They draw clear lines. They speak a language that tries unmistakably to distinguish who's in and who's out, which often entails not only meting out punishment for the latter, but even considering them enemies. The language of the councils, of which the canon was emblematic, was sometimes vehement in its depiction of those who presumably were subverting the good of the church, whether by bad belief or bad behavior. The language is agonistic, a battle against a foe. Pope Julius II's decree in the Fifth Lateran Council, 1512, against the cardinals who attempted to depose him, minced no words. We condemn, reject, and detest each and everything done by those sons of perdition. With the approval of this sacred council. All allowances must, of course, be made for many differences, but the point I'm trying to make is that the councils from Nicaea to Vatican I had a characteristic style of discourse. The style was composed of two basic elements. The first was a literary genre, the canon or its equivalent. The second element was the vocabulary typical of the genre and appropriate to it. This vocabulary consisted for the most part in words of threat and intimidation, words implying a superior speaking to inferiors, or just as often to an enemy. All this sounds grim. It might sound devoid of even the slightest concern for the spirit, a good case of the letter killing. I think we might need to employ here some hermeneutic of compassion and realize, for instance, that sometimes surveillance and punishment is the only way to go if we want to change behavior, and that changing behavior can sometimes result in a change of heart. These enactments deal with the exterior, but insofar as they are inspired by Christian principles, they must be presumed not to be entirely devoid of relationship to inner conversion. Be that as it may, this style of discourse expressed and promoted procedures in accord with a certain style of being. That meant it expressed and promoted a certain style of how the church itself behaves. The decrees of Trent illustrate the point. Despite the achievements of the council, inconceivable without the language game the council adopted, in the long run, the decrees enforced social disciplining as an ecclesiastical style and promoted an image of the church as a stern, exigent, and suspicious parent. The language projected the image, and the image promoted the reality and helped it self-fulfill. Behave thus or else. In the 19th century, this reality expressed itself with increased insistence and prominence at the highest level in the style of papal pronouncements, such as Gregory XVI's Mirari Vos 1832, Pius IX's Syllabus of Errors 1864, and in the early 20th century, Pius X's Lamentabili and Pascendi 1907. The language of these documents is the language of adversarial relationships. We would have drowned, said Gregory in Mirari Vos, as a result of the terrible conspiracy of impious men, so that we had to restrain their great obstinacy with the rod. Depravity exalts, science is impudent, liberty dissolute. The holiness of the sacred is despised, and errors of all kinds spread broadly. The errors Gregory especially meant were freedom of the press, liberty of conscience, separation of church and state, and not the least, rebellion against monarchs. When Vatican II opened, that style was still normative, at least for certain kinds of ecclesiastical statements. As is well known, the first serious clash at the Council between the progressives and conservatives took place in mid-November 1962 over the document on Scripture, which included debate over the document's style. Besides other traits of the legislative judicial style, the document contained expressions like that no one dare say and the Church utterly condemns. At that very early point in the Council, Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani, head of the Holy Office of the Inquisition and chief architect of the document, felt compelled to defend it precisely on that point. He insisted that that style was, quotation, the style that has been sanctioned by the practice of the ages. During the first period of the Council, the progressives continued to insist on a pastoral style, and the conservatives just as vehemently to oppose it. This was, therefore, an explicit and important issue in the Council, and the new style did not slip into it unnoticed. By the second period, 1963, the conservatives had been forced to throw in the towel on this issue, but not without still nagging criticism. I suspect that neither side saw the full implication of the change. The dominant literary genre of the documents of Vatican II is the panegyric. That is, the painting of an idealized portrait in order to excite admiration and appropriation. This is an old genre in religious discourse, used extensively by the fathers of the Church in their homilies and other writings. It came not from the legal tradition of classical antiquity, but from the humanistic or literary. How did the Council come to adopt this form? I do not know. But much of the ressourcement in France before the Council was directed to the Fathers, whose style and approach were seen as an antidote to the sterile dead end the scholars of the ressourcement considered the dominant neo-scholastic tradition to be. The model was at hand, therefore. The first document to come to the fore of the Council that began to use this style was the revised version of the document on the Church, Lumen Gentium. For me, it can hardly be a coincidence that the chapter titles of Henri de Lubac's Méditation sur l'Église, 1954, correlate rather remarkably with those into which Lumen Gentium itself was divided. That Méditation was written in a style strongly reminiscent of the poetical, rhetorical style of the Fathers. No matter how little or how much de Lubac's book influenced the development of Lumen Gentium, in that document, the Council raised up before our eyes the Church, Christ, God, and the dignity of our human nature to excite us to wonder and admiration. It engaged in a rhetoric of praise and congratulation. It engaged in a panegyric, in the ars laudandi, a rhetorical genre well known and widely practiced in antiquity, whose technical name is epideictic or demonstrative rhetoric. In its opening chapter, Lumen Gentium described the Church as mystery, something beyond definition, thus moving the Council away from what councils had always done, define. The purpose of the genre, therefore, is not so much to clarify concepts as to heighten appreciation for a person, an event, and institutions, and to excite emulation of an ideal. If most 4th of July speeches are secular examples of the genre at its worst, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is an example of it at its best. Lincoln tried simply to raise appreciation for what was at stake, and at least by implication, to praise it as noble and worthy of the great cost. He wanted to touch the affect of his audience by holding up ideals whose attractiveness would motivate them to strive to achieve them. He employed a rhetoric of invitation. The documents of Vatican II, however you explain it, fit into this mold. That is their style. They hold up ideals, and they often draw conclusions from them and spell out consequences, as with the decree on bishops, in which the bishop's responsibilities are clearly laid out. The responsibilities are laid out, however, not as a code of conduct to be enforced, but as an ideal to be striven for, with the understanding that they are to be adapted to times and circumstances. The epideictic genre is a form of the art of persuasion, and thus of reconciliation. While it raises appreciation, it creates or fosters among those it addresses a realization that they all share or should share the same ideals and need to work together to achieve them. This genre reminds people of what they have in common rather than what might divide them. And the reminder motivates them to cooperate in enterprises more important than what they perceive as differences among them. To engage in persuasion is to some extent to put oneself on the same level as those being persuaded. Persuaders do not command from on high. Otherwise, they would not be persuading, but coercing. Persuasion works from the inside out. In order to persuade, persuaders need to establish an identity between themselves and their audience, and to make them understand that they share the same concerns, the same hopes and fears, joys and sorrows. These are some traits of the genre, and these are the traits that characterize the Discourse of Vatican II. The Council was about persuading and inviting. To attain that end, it used principally the epideictic genre. I am, of course, not saying that the bishops and theologians self-consciously adopted a specific genre of classical rhetoric as such. But I am saying that the documents of the Council, for whatever reason, fit that pattern and therefore need to be interpreted accordingly. The most concrete manifestation of the character of the genre, and therefore an important key to interpreting its import, is the vocabulary it adopts and fosters. Nowhere is that vocabulary more significant than in Vatican II, and nowhere more a contrast than with the councils that preceded it. Nowhere is the council more indicative of what the genre stands for, and therefore of the style of church the council promoted by means of it. We must therefore look at words. First, what kind of words are absent? Notably missing are words of alienation, exclusion, enmity, words of threat and intimidation, words of surveillance and punishment. Anathema does not appear a single time. Although the hierarchical character of the church is repeatedly stressed, and the prerogatives of the Supreme Pontiff reiterated almost obsessively, the church is never described as a monarchy or the members of the church as subjects. That is a great departure from previous practice. What kinds of words are present? Words new to council vocabulary. None of them can be considered casual asides or mere window dressing, mere rhetoric. They are used far too insistently and too characteristically for that. They do not occur here and there, but are an across-the-board phenomenon, appearing in all or almost all the final documents. If one wishes to get at the spirit of Vatican II, they are the best indicators of what that spirit is. They make it possible for us to escape from the proof texting that has beset the documents of Vatican II and allow us to rise to patterns and overall orientation. They provide us with that much sought-after horizon of interpretation. They provide us with what Cardinal Ruini wants, a new hermeneutic. I will divide the words into categories, but the categories are imperfectly distinct from one another. They overlap and crisscross back and forth, making the same or related points. They are all, moreover, consonant with the epideictic genre and with the wider rhetorical tradition, something that I have described at length in my book, Four Cultures of the West. Genre and vocabulary taken together constitute and manifest a style of discourse, which almost by definition manifests the style, the how of the person speaking. In this instance, the person speaking is the church. One category is made up of horizontal words. Words like brothers and sisters stress and give color to the wide range of horizontal relationships that characterize the church. They contrast with the vertical or top-down words typical of former councils and of the 19th century papacy. The most widely invoked of such horizontal words after the council, and the one that remains best known, despite its problematic implications, is people of God. Among the horizontal words are reciprocity words, such as cooperation, partnership, and collaboration. Striking in Gaudium et Spes, the final document of the council, are the bold statements that just as the world learns from the church learns from the world. In this case, oh wonder, from the modern world. But in this horizontal reciprocity category, the two most significant words are dialogue and collegiality. It sometimes seems that there is hardly a page in the council documents in which dialogue or its equivalent does not occur. Dialogue manifests a radical shift from the prophetic "I say unto you" style that earlier prevailed. Collegiality, as we well know, did not find its way into the council's vocabulary without a fierce battle, a battle that in fact continues in different form today. Implicit in these reciprocity words, moreover, is engagement and even initiative. In the document on the laity, the council, for instance, tells them that they have the right and sometimes the duty to make their opinions known. Implicitly, the reciprocity words are empowerment words. Closely related to reciprocity words are friendship words. The most striking is the all-inclusive human family to whom Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world, is addressed. Similarly related are humility words, beginning with the description of the church as pilgrim. Among the redefinitions the council silently effected is what it did with the triad prophet, priest, king. In some passages, prophet becomes partner in dialogue, priesthood is extended to all believers, and king defined as servant. The triad was applied to everybody in the church, laity as well as clergy, and appears in document after document. Even though the word change occurs in the first paragraph of the decree on the liturgy, the first document approved by the council, the well-known Catholic allergy to that word prevails elsewhere. A remarkable feature of the vocabulary of the council, nonetheless, is the employment of words that in fact indicate change, words like development, progress, and even evolution. Pilgrim perhaps should be included here. The most familiar change word associated with Vatican II, of course, is the innocent-sounding aggiornamento. No doubt it can be interpreted in a minimal and traditional sense, probably the sense John the 23rd intended. But when framed within the full context of the council, it becomes one more indicator of a more historical and therefore relativized and open-ended approach to issues and problems. It implies the inevitability of further change in the future and suggests that the council itself must be interpreted in an open-ended way. The council cannot be interpreted and implemented as if it said, thus far and no further. The final category I would call attention to is interiority words. Joy and hope, grief and anguish. These are the famous opening words of Gaudium et Spes. The document goes on. For disciples of Christ, nothing that is human fails to find echo in their hearts. Yes, in their hearts. Vatican II was about the inward journey. It was about holiness. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the document on the church is chapter 5, the call to holiness. Holiness is what the church is about. An old truth, this, of course, but no previous council had ever explicitly asserted it, and certainly never developed it at such length. It is a call to something more than an external form. It is, as the document describes it, related more immediately to the outpouring of the Spirit in the hearts of the faithful, to their free and willing acceptance of the gospel, and to their commitment to service of others in the world. In this regard, the emphasis of the Council on conscience as the ultimate norm and moral choice is remarkable. I quote, "Deep within their conscience, individuals discover a law that they do not make for themselves, but that they are bound to obey, whose voice is ever summoning them to love, and to do what is good and avoid what is evil ring in their hearts. While Catholics must take full and serious account of church teaching and guidance, they must ultimately be guided by the inner law. Preachers, theologians, and saints have always taught this in some form or other, but no council has ever said it, at least never said it so clearly. I will summarize in a simple litany some of the elements in the change in style of the church indicated by the council's vocabulary. From commands to ideals, from threats to invitations, from coercion to conscience, from monologue to conversation, from ruling to serving, from withdrawn to engaged, from vertical and top-down to horizontal, from exclusion to inclusion, from hostility to friendship, from static to changing, from passive acceptance to active engagement, from prescriptive to principled, from defined to open-ended, from behavior modification to conversion of heart, from the dictates of law to the dictates of conscience, from external conformity to the joyful pursuit of holiness. When these elements are taken in the aggregate, they seem to me to indicate a model shift. Gosh. Taken in the aggregate, they seem to express something that can be called the spirit of the council. Despite all their literary weaknesses, the documents of Vatican II are literary documents, and as such they evince a literary unity. That's new in a council. The documents are not a grab-bag collection of ordinances. This feature makes it possible to get at a spirit, for the medium, in its genre and vocabulary, conveys a remarkably unified message that transcends the particularities of the documents. The form conveys content. Every one of the elements in the litany, of course, needs 1,000 qualifications. The horizontal words of the council must be balanced by the vertical, and so forth. But the litany as a whole conveys the sweep of the change in the style of the church the Second Vatican Council held up for contemplation and actualization. Style in this sense is not an ornament, not a superficial affectation, but expression of deepest personality. In this sense, it is the ultimate expression of meaning. Le style, c'est le même. My style. My how. Expresses what I am in my truest and deepest self. This teaching on the style of the church is an implicit but insistent call for a change in style. A style that is less autocratic and more collaborative. A style that is willing to listen to different viewpoints and take them into account. A style that is open and above board. A style committed to fair play. A style that assumes innocence until guilt is proven. A style that eschews secret oaths, anonymous denunciations, and inquisitorial tactics. The shift of Vatican II in style of discourse has, therefore, deep ramifications. It, along with the many other special features I have mentioned, made Vatican II unlike any previous council. In fact, by adopting the style it did, the council, in effect, redefined what a council is. Vatican II, that is to say, did not take the Roman Senate as its implicit model. I find it difficult to pinpoint just what its implicit model was, but it seems to me closer to guide, partner, and friend than it does to lawmaker, police officer, inquisitor, or judge. Is there a before and after Vatican II? Is there any noteworthy discontinuity between the council and what preceded it? Did anything happen? When the council ended in 1965, 40 years ago, practically everybody would have answered those questions in a resounding affirmative, to the point that Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre condemned the council as heretical and led a group into schism. Today, however, powerful, learned, and well-informed people are responding in the negative. Me? Well, of one thing I am convinced. The council wanted something to happen. Or do you think I'm letting myself be dazzled and seduced by mere rhetoric?